Chapter 1, The Night of Two Systems. The night I was branded worthless, my stepbrother was branded a god. I want to tell you now, before anything else, that I am not going to make this a story about hatred. It is a story about arithmetic. About what happens when you underestimate the value of a single, unglamorous line item for 11 years running. My name is Arden Voss. On the night of the Ascension, the night every child in our world receives a system on their 16th birthday, a set of powers and stats that will define the rest of their life, my stepbrother Marcus Thorne and I stood side by side in the same ballroom, under the same chandelier, and were given two entirely different futures. His interface bloomed gold. Genius system, it read, in lettering that lit the whole room like a sunrise. Instant mastery of any skill he touched. Perfect recall. A growth curve so steep the family's own system appraiser wept reading it out loud, actually wept, right there in front of 200 guests. Mine bloomed gray. Worthless system. No combat class. No stat bonuses. No visible skills at all. Just a single flat description that the appraiser read aloud with open pity, the same voice you'd use to deliver a diagnosis, absorbs loss. Converts deficit into latent growth. Rate, unknown. Ceiling, unknown. The room laughed. Not cruelly, exactly, the kind of laugh people give when they don't know what else to do with an awkward silence. My stepfather did not laugh, which was somehow worse. He simply looked at me the way you look at a possession that has depreciated overnight, doing the math on whether it's still worth keeping in the house. Chapter 2, The House of Thorn. Understand the shape of my family before I go further, because none of what follows makes sense without it. My stepfather, Richard Thorn, built Thorn Holdings from a single freight yard into a name spoken in the same breath as old money. He was not a cruel man by his own accounting, he simply believed, completely, that worth was a thing you could see, and that a system interface was the most honest mirror ever invented. My birth mother, Elaine Voss, had married him for love, back when love still seemed like the point of the arrangement. She spent the following decade being quietly reminded, in 100 small ways, that she was the second wife, the replaceable one, the woman whose son did not share the Thorn blood and therefore did not fully share the Thorn future. Marcus was Richard's son twice over, by blood, and after the Ascension, by destiny. Every door in that house opened for him before he reached for it. Tutors rearranged their calendars. Sponsors called before he'd finished his first semester of training. The family's own system appraiser, the same woman who had wept reading his interface, began appearing at breakfast twice a week just to track his growth curve like it was a stock she'd bet her career on. I was given a room above the old stables, at the far edge of the property, close enough to see the main house's lights and far enough that no one had to see me see them. Chapter 3, What a Room Above the Stables Teaches You. The stables had been empty of horses for a decade by the time I moved in. Richard had sold them off years earlier as an inefficiency, so the room came with cold stone floors, a single window that didn't seal properly against winter, and a silence I learned to fill with reading, because there was nothing else to do out there once the sun went down and no one was coming to check on me. My mother tried, in her small ways, to close the gap Richard's household opened wider every year. An extra plate quietly carried out to me after family dinners I wasn't invited to. A coat mended rather than replaced, stitched by her own hands late at night so Richard wouldn't see the expense on a ledger he checked more carefully than he checked on either of us. A hand on my shoulder, wordless, when his disappointment filled a room like weather nobody could argue with. It was never enough to change anything structural. It cost her more than either of us ever said aloud. I understood only much later how much of her own comfort, her own standing in that house, she spent keeping mine from collapsing entirely. Marcus, for his part, never had to be cruel to me directly. Cruelty requires effort, and he never needed to spend any on me. He simply existed in every space I might have occupied, brighter, easier, first through every door, and let the comparison do the work. When he was handed the keys to a satellite division at 22, to test his instincts, nobody in that house thought to ask what my worthless system had been quietly doing for 6 years by then. Nobody thought to ask, because nobody thought there was anything to find. That was the whole design of being written off. No one audits a number they've already decided is zero. Chapter 4, The Allowance. I want to tell you about the allowance, because it's a small thing and small things are where you can see a family's true accounting most clearly. Until I turned 18, I received a modest monthly stipend, Richard's minimum legal obligation as my stepfather, nothing more, dispensed by an assistant rather than handed to me personally, the way you'd pay an invoice rather than support a son. The week I turned 18, it stopped arriving. No conversation. No letter. I checked my account on a Tuesday morning and the number that had reliably appeared every month for 2 years simply wasn't there, and never would be again. I asked Richard about it once, directly, the only time I ever confronted him about anything in that house. He looked genuinely confused by the question, as if I'd asked him to explain why water was wet. "You're an adult now," he said. "Marcus doesn't need an allowance either." Marcus, at that point, had access to a company card with no meaningful limit and 3 separate accounts Richard had opened in his name before he could legally drive. The comparison wasn't an oversight. It was simply how little thought my finances required once I'd stopped being useful to track. Chapter 5, The System No One Read Twice. Here is what none of them understood, because none of them read the appraisal a second time. Absorbs loss. Converts deficit into latent growth. Every insult I swallowed. Every unpaid month. Every night I went without heat in that room above the stables because fixing the window wasn't in anyone's budget for me. Every door shut in my face, every tutor who cancelled on a whim, every meal I quietly skipped so my mother wouldn't have to skip hers when Richard was watching the household accounts too closely. The system took all of it in, silently, and turned it into something. Not points on a flashy display Marcus could glance at and feel superior about. A slow, compounding, invisible interest rate on every wrong done to me, accruing in a ledger only I could see. By 19 I understood the rough shape of what I was carrying, even without full visibility into it. By 21 I had a name for the ability that finally surfaced from the depths of the system, once enough loss had accumulated to unlock it, total recall of value. I could look at any asset, any contract, any person's balance sheet, spoken, written, or merely implied, and see its true worth, stripped of reputation, stripped of family name, stripped of every convenient lie built on top of it. It is a quiet power. It has never once glowed gold in a ballroom. It has also never once, in over a decade, been wrong. Chapter 6, The Forgery. The end of my time in that house began with a piece of paper I never touched. Richard had spent years half convinced, in some low-simmering way he never quite said aloud, that I resented Marcus enough to eventually do something about it. He found what he considered proof one autumn evening, a signature on an old family document, a transfer authorization for a minor trust, that looked, at a careless glance, like mine. It wasn't. It took me nearly 4 years to prove definitively who had actually forged it and why, and by the time I could prove it, it no longer mattered to anyone but me. Richard didn't ask questions that night. He didn't ask to hear my side, didn't call in the family's own appraiser to actually verify the handwriting, didn't do any of the careful checking he prided himself on doing before every business decision he ever made. He called it theft, once, in a voice that closed the subject permanently, and had 2 of his men walk me to the gate like I was a trespasser rather than someone who had lived under that roof for 11 years. Chapter 7, What Marcus Did Not Say. Marcus watched from the top of the stairs while it happened and said nothing at all. I want to sit with that silence for a moment, because I've turned it over more times than almost any other memory from that house. He didn't gloat. He didn't smirk. He didn't offer a single word of defense on my behalf, either. Not one sentence suggesting that perhaps a signature should be checked by someone who actually knew both our handwriting before a decade of family history was discarded over it. His silence was the gloat. It cost him nothing to simply let it happen, the same way it had cost him nothing, for 11 years, to simply exist in every space I might have occupied. I don't think Marcus ever hated me. I think, worse, he never thought about me enough to hate me. I was a rounding error in his life story, and rounding errors don't require an opinion. Chapter 8, The Gate. My mother came to the gate an hour later with a small bag of my things and every bit of cash she had quietly hidden from Richard over the years, folded into an envelope she pressed into my hands like it was something dangerous to be caught holding. She didn't argue with Richard's decision in front of me. I understood only years later that she had already tried, upstairs, in a conversation I never heard and she never fully described. What she gave me at that gate wasn't an argument. It was smaller and, it turned out, far more useful. Write down every true thing, she told me. That was all. No dramatic speech, no promise that everything would be fine, no assurance that Richard would come around. Just that one instruction, delivered plainly, the way you'd hand someone a tool rather than sympathy. It sounds like a small inheritance. It has been the only advice I have ever actually needed. Chapter 9, The First Winter. I will not dramatize the years that followed more than they deserve. I slept in places I won't describe in detail to make you feel something manufactured about them. I worked jobs that paid in exhaustion more than money, loading docks, night shifts at warehouses not unlike the ones I would one day own, work that asked nothing of a system interface because no one checks your stats before handing you a crate to carry. What I did have, every single day of that first winter, was the system, quietly compounding beneath a surface no one else could see, and a decision I made under a highway overpass on the coldest night of that year, with an old man beside me who had been sleeping rough far longer than I had and taught me more about patience in one conversation than 11 years in the Thorn House ever had. I would not spend a single hour of my life performing revenge. I would spend it building the only thing that actually wins in the end, an accurate account of the truth, and the patience to wait until it mattered. Chapter 10, Ledgerline. I built a small appraisal firm under a name that meant nothing to anyone who might have recognized me, Ledgerline Partners. No flash. No system displays in the lobby, because there was no lobby for the first 2 years, just a folding table and a laptop and a reputation I built one correct number at a time. Just relentlessly accurate work, sold quietly to people who needed to know what something was actually worth before they signed for it. Small business owners, family estates, the kind of clients no prestige firm bothered courting because the fees were too modest to matter. It mattered to me. Every correct appraisal was a brick. I had decided, under that overpass, that I would build a wall of them rather than a single dramatic gesture, and bricks, it turns out, are far more durable than fireworks. Chapter 11, Sophia. 2 people found their way to that firm who mattered more to what came next than anyone besides my mother. Sophia Reyes had been the sharpest auditor at Thorn Holdings, sharp enough that Marcus's own team routed their most sensitive numbers through her specifically, because her sign-off meant something to the board. She refused to sign off on a set of figures Marcus wanted signed regardless, numbers that didn't reconcile with the actual state of a subsidiary's inventory, and was fired within the week for the crime of being right at an inconvenient moment. She walked into my folding table office 18 months later, having heard through some quiet channel that a small firm called Ledgerline actually cared whether numbers were true. She didn't know who I was. I didn't tell her for over a year, not until I trusted that her honesty was a principle and not a performance. It was neither performance nor coincidence that the person Marcus's arrogance had discarded turned out to be exactly the discipline my quiet little firm needed most. Chapter 12, Derek. Derek Hale had run the loading floor at a Thorn subsidiary for 11 years, the same 11 years I'd spent above the stables and then underneath overpasses, though neither of us knew it at the time. He kept every truck on schedule, every worker trained properly, every safety incident at zero for the better part of a decade, the unglamorous kind of excellence that never makes an annual report. He was let go the same month Marcus decided, based on a genius-fueled hunch rather than any actual audit of the numbers, that automation looked better in a shareholder presentation than 11 years of a man's careful competence did. Derek found Ledgerline the way most of my early people did, word of mouth among the discarded, a quiet network of people who had learned the hard way which employers actually checked their work and which one simply trusted a shiny interface to be right. Both Sophia and Derek had been written off exactly the way I had, for exactly the same underlying reason. They were correct in ways that were inconvenient to a system that mistook speed for accuracy. Both of them, it turned out, were precisely the exacting, unglamorous foundation my quiet little firm needed to become something bigger than a folding table. Chapter 13, The Empire Built on Shine. While I built Ledgerline in the dark, one careful brick at a time, Marcus built an empire in the light, and for a long time the whole world agreed it was beautiful to look at. Genius system does not, it turns out, come with a stat for patience, or humility, or the willingness to check your own work twice. He was celebrated everywhere for instincts so fast he never had to learn to slow down and verify anything, magazine profiles calling him a generational talent, industry panels built entirely around asking him to explain gut decisions he'd made in seconds that somehow, most of the time, still worked out. Most of the time was doing a great deal of quiet work in that sentence, and no one was checking the times it didn't. Chapter 14, The People He Cut. He cut the careful people first, because his system told him, correctly in the narrowest sense, that he could do their jobs faster alone. He never asked whether faster and correct were the same thing, because for the first several years, riding the momentum of decisions that happened to land right, they appeared to be. Sophia was one of dozens. Derek was one of hundreds. Across 6 years, Thorn Holdings quietly hollowed out its own institutional memory, the auditors who caught small errors before they compounded, the floor managers who knew which shortcuts were actually dangerous and which just looked dangerous to people who'd never worked a dock, the analysts who read a contract twice before recommending it. Marcus replaced almost all of them with systems that moved at his speed and confirmed his instincts, because confirmation felt, to him, indistinguishable from correctness. Chapter 15, The Rot Beneath the Shine. Thorn Holdings hollowed out from the inside for years before anyone outside noticed, because from the outside it still gleamed exactly as brightly as it always had. Marcus took on debt against assets he'd stopped actually maintaining, trusting the appraised values on file rather than the deteriorating reality behind them. He shorted competitors on information that was, increasingly, simply wrong, because the analysts who would once have caught the error were gone, replaced by people whose job was agreement rather than scrutiny. I watched all of this the way you watch a house you used to live in slowly catching fire from a room you can see but they can't see you from. I did not light the match. I want to be precise about that, because it matters to me more than almost anything else in this account. I only refused, for a very long time, to help put it out, and refusing to rescue someone from a fire they built themselves is not the same thing as arson, whatever it might have looked like from inside that house. Chapter 16, The Honest Tender. The turn began with something almost boring, a public port and regional logistics contract, 20 years long, unglamorous, the kind of infrastructure work that keeps a city's food and freight moving and never makes a single headline no matter how well or badly it's run. Thorn Holdings assumed they would win it on name alone, the way they'd won every contract for a decade. They had let their actual cold chain capacity rot for years under Marcus's cuts, trusting that reputation would carry weight the underlying assets no longer could. Ledgerline, quietly rebuilt under Derek's steady hand into a real logistics operator, not merely an appraisal firm anymore, with Sophia's books kept so honestly that our own bid held up to scrutiny that would have destroyed a company built on shortcuts, was actually ready. I bid on the merit of the work itself, not the weight of a name, in front of an independent examiner who had never heard of me and, crucially, didn't need to. We won on the numbers. It was the first time in 11 years that anything about my life had been decided by what was actually true rather than who I happened to be born to. Chapter 17, What the Market Said. Thorn's stock did the one thing Marcus's arrogance could never survive, it told the truth. It fell, not dramatically at first, just a slow correction as the market began pricing in a company that had just lost a flagship contract it had assumed was guaranteed. Underneath that fall was something Marcus never checked twice, in all his years of instinct-driven decisions, that the mortgage on his own headquarters, quietly bought years earlier through a shell entity called Meridian Holdings that his own team never bothered tracing back, had always, from the very beginning, belonged to me. Chapter 18, The Squeeze. What followed had no villain in it at all, which is the part people find hardest to believe when I tell this story. It was simply arithmetic catching up with itself. Short sellers who had bet against Thorn on the strength of Marcus's own overconfident public statements suddenly found themselves needing to cover positions as the stock's fall accelerated past what anyone had modeled. Brokers who had extended credit against inflated asset values began calling in margins Marcus's team had never planned for, because planning for the numbers being wrong wasn't a scenario his system had ever flagged as worth preparing for. I did not orchestrate the squeeze. I had simply, for years, refused to be the correction that made everyone else's overconfident math work out. Once I stopped, the math corrected itself, the way it always eventually does. Chapter 19, The Examiner. I did not have to expose the fraud in Thorn Holdings books myself. I only had to stop protecting Marcus from the consequences of never checking his own work. An independent examiner, brought in by panicked shareholders as the stock cratered and questions multiplied, found exactly what a decade of unaudited shortcuts leaves behind for anyone patient enough to actually look: cooked numbers stretching back years, a shell trail leading back through discarded staff records to a care trust Marcus had quietly looted to cover an early cash shortfall, the same trust that should have paid for my mother's care during her final illness, and never did, because the money simply wasn't there anymore by the time she needed it. I did not learn about the trust until the examiner's report surfaced it. I want you to understand that finding it changed something in me, not toward more anger, but toward a colder, more complete certainty that I had spent too many years being careful with a man who had never once been careful with anyone who couldn't fight back. Chapter 20, Sophia's Records. Sophia handed the examiner 4 years of records she had kept, out of nothing but stubborn honesty, long after anyone stopped paying her to keep them, figures she'd quietly preserved even after her firing, because some part of her had always known someone, eventually, would need an accurate account of what Thorn Holdings actually was underneath the shine. It was never revenge for her either, and I think that surprised the examiner more than anything else in the whole investigation. It was just refusing, finally, after years of being told her honesty was inconvenient, to let the true numbers stay hidden any longer than they already had been. Chapter 21, The Gala. Marcus threw a gala the same week the examiner's report was due to become public, a memorial for Richard, who had passed the year before still believing his golden son could do no wrong, still convinced to his last breath that the system interface that had glowed gold in a ballroom decades earlier had been telling the whole truth about a person's worth. Under the same chandeliers, in front of the whole gleaming world that had always loved him without ever once auditing him, I walked in wearing a suit that fit a life he didn't recognize and a face he'd apparently spent so little time considering over the years that he didn't immediately place it across the room. Chapter 22, You Did This. He found me in the emptying hall near the end of the night, no longer luminous, the report already leaking through the room in whispers that were rearranging every face I passed. You did this, he said, and for the first time in my life I watched something like real fear move behind his eyes. You did this, I told him. I only refused to catch you. I told him, plainly, what the worthless system had actually been doing every single day for 11 years while everyone around us assumed it was doing nothing at all, absorbing every loss he handed me without a second thought, and turning it, patiently, brick by invisible brick, into the only kind of power that was never going to run out on its own. Not strength. Not speed. Not a number that glows gold in a ballroom for one night and then has to be maintained forever after. Just an accurate account, kept honestly, for exactly as long as it took to matter. Chapter 23, What Remains. I did not take everything. I want to be honest about that too, because burning it all down would have been easy, would have felt satisfying for perhaps an afternoon, and would have cost the 2,000 people who still worked the Thorn docks their jobs for nothing but my own satisfaction. I kept the core, the warehouses, the cold chain, the honest unglamorous work that had nothing to do with Marcus's shine and everything to do with Derek's 11 years of careful competence, and let the rest, the shine built on debt and shortcuts and a trust that should have belonged to a dying woman, fall the way it was always going to fall once someone finally checked the numbers twice. Derek runs those docks now, building instead of taking, proud of work that finally gets to be seen for what it actually is. Sophia keeps every book open where no second, hidden set of numbers can ever grow in the dark again. I made her a real partner, with real protection written into the structure itself, because I had learned exactly what it costs a person to have none. Chapter 24, My Mother's Habit. As for me, I kept my mother's habit, the only inheritance that ever actually mattered. See the true number. Write it down. Don't stop, even when everyone around you has already decided, with total confidence, that you're worth exactly nothing. That was never the system's gift, not really. The system only gave the habit somewhere to compound. The habit itself was hers, handed to me at a gate on the worst night of my life, and it turned out to be worth more than every gold-lettered interface that ever lit up a ballroom. Chapter 25, A Closing Word. I am not going to tell you this story to make you trust more easily. I have paid too much, over too many years, for easy lies to hand you one now, sitting here at the end of it. I will tell you the only thing I know for certain, the same thing I have known since a highway overpass and an old man's patience and one instruction from my mother rearranged what I thought power actually was: keep the record. Whatever they call you, worthless, discarded, a rounding error not worth a second glance, keep an honest account of what is actually true, and wait. The market, eventually, always tells the truth. So do people, if you are patient enough, and careful enough, to let them.